HOA Karen blocks wheelchair ramp construction with her car. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It was a crisp and quiet morning when Carlos and his team of contractors arrived at the small suburban neighborhood to begin the construction of a much-needed wheelchair ramp for his wife, Maria. After years of struggling with stairs and limited mobility, Maria had finally gotten her doctor's approval to have the ramp installed at their front door. For Carlos, it was more than just a home improvement project. It was a way to restore his wife's independence, to help her regain a sense of freedom she had been denied for so long. He had already received the necessary permits, and all the paperwork was in order. The contractor had arrived early, the sun still low in the sky, with the hum of the construction vehicles providing the only sound in the otherwise still neighborhood. The morning seemed full of promise, full of the hope that Maria would finally be able to navigate their home without assistance. Carlos and the crew unloaded the tools and materials, setting up for the day's work. The ramp was going to be ADA compliant, built to the exact specifications necessary to provide Maria with the safe, easy access she desperately needed. The team worked efficiently, measuring and cutting wood, while Carlos supervised, occasionally checking the plans to ensure everything would be perfect for Maria. There was an air of quiet optimism as they worked. It was a small but significant project, a way to enhance Maria's quality of life and allow her the dignity of moving around her own home with ease. For Carlos, the day was supposed to be one of accomplishment. But that calm morning was shattered when the sound of a car engine revving broke through the peaceful atmosphere. Carlos paused, looking up just in time to see a silver sedan speeding down the street, tires squealing as it made a sharp turn toward his house. Before he could even react, the car barreled toward the construction site, crashing into the partially constructed ramp with a force that sent wood and debris flying in every direction. The team froze in shock as the car continued to plow through the ramp, grinding against the wooden planks, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The car finally came to a stop, its front end wedged halfway into the ramp, a mangled heap of broken wood and twisted metal. Carlos's heart raced as he ran toward the scene, his thoughts a blur. He was still trying to process what had just happened when the driver's side door flew open, and out stepped none other than Karen, the neighbor who lived 2 houses down. "What the hell are you doing?" Carlos shouted, his voice filled with disbelief and anger. He was too stunned to feel anything else in the moment, too taken aback by the sheer audacity of what had just occurred. Karen didn't seem to share his shock. She stood there for a moment, surveying the damage she had caused, before slowly removing her sunglasses and fixing her eyes on him. "You're making this neighborhood look like a hospital," she snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. "I've already told you, I don't want this kind of thing here. It's unsightly. It's an eyesore." Carlos's jaw dropped as he tried to process what she was saying. "You destroyed our ramp. You just destroyed it with your car," he exclaimed, his voice rising in frustration. Karen, however, didn't seem the least bit concerned about the damage she had just caused. She straightened her posture, an air of entitlement surrounding her, as though she were perfectly justified in her actions. "You don't need a ramp. This is a nice neighborhood, and we don't need things like that disrupting the beauty of it." "A hospital ramp? Really?" she said, her voice filled with judgment. "Do you know what this will do to property values? You're making it look like a medical facility in here." Carlos's mind was racing as he stood there, trying to come to terms with the absurdity of Karen's words. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Karen had never been particularly warm or friendly, but this was something else entirely. She had actually taken it upon herself to destroy something that would make his wife's life better, something that would help her regain her independence. And for what? Because she didn't like how it looked? "You've got to be kidding me," Carlos muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is for my wife. She's disabled. She needs this to get around." Karen's face twisted in disdain. "I don't care what you need," she snapped, her tone cutting. "This is about the neighborhood. We have standards here, and we don't let things like this just happen. You're going to ruin the whole look of the block with a wheelchair ramp. How embarrassing." Carlos was beyond frustrated. His voice shook with anger as he stepped closer to her. "You don't understand. You don't understand what this means for her, for us," he said, his fists clenching at his sides. "This ramp is for my wife. She's been struggling for years, and this is the first time she'll be able to get in and out of the house without help. But you just came in here and destroyed it because it doesn't fit with your precious neighborhood standards." Karen's expression softened slightly, but it was only a shift in demeanor, not an indication of any real remorse. "I don't care," she said bluntly. "You should have asked for approval. You didn't. And now you're paying the price." Carlos could feel his blood boiling. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he tried to control his temper. He couldn't let this woman, this person who had no regard for his wife's well-being, win. "You're going to pay for this," he said through gritted teeth. "You're going to pay for the damage you've done." "I don't think so," Karen said, a smug look crossing her face. "What are you going to do? Take me to court? You're the one who broke the rules, not me." Carlos stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, trying to decide what his next step would be. He couldn't let this go unchallenged. He knew that he had to report what happened, but part of him was still processing the injustice of it all. His wife's mobility, her freedom, had just been taken away, and for what? Because Karen didn't want the neighborhood to look like a hospital? It was all so senseless. As Carlos stood there, trying to make sense of the situation, the contractors were already gathering around, talking among themselves, assessing the damage. The ramp that had taken hours to plan and begin constructing was now a pile of wreckage. The sound of Karen's car engine had broken the calm, but the broken ramp symbolized something far worse than just a physical structure. It was a cruel reminder of the people who would stop at nothing to ensure others stayed oppressed. Carlos turned to his team, his eyes determined. "We're going to fix this. We're going to rebuild. She's not going to stop us. We're doing this for Maria. We're doing this for us." The contractors nodded in silent agreement, rallying behind Carlos. Karen, who had been standing there silently for a moment, turned to walk back to her car. "I'll be contacting the HOA about this," she said dismissively, her voice dripping with superiority. Carlos stood his ground, refusing to let her words intimidate him. "You can do whatever you want, but this ramp is happening. We'll rebuild it, and we'll fight for what's right. You're not going to stop us." With that, Karen got in her car and drove off, leaving Carlos standing there, determined. As the contractors began to clear the debris, Carlos felt the weight of what had happened settle into him. It wasn't just about the ramp anymore, it was about a larger fight, a fight for dignity, respect, and the right to live freely in his own home. The road ahead would be difficult, but he wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. Maria deserved better, and he was going to make sure she got it. The ramp would be rebuilt, and Karen's attempt to tear it down would only strengthen their resolve. The damage caused by Karen's reckless actions lingered in Carlos's mind long after she had driven off, her car leaving behind nothing but the shredded remnants of the wheelchair ramp. As the contractors began to assess the mess she had created, Carlos felt a mixture of disbelief, rage, and helplessness. He couldn't fathom how anyone could be so callous, so self-righteous, and so entirely dismissive of the basic human dignity of another person. He stood there for a moment, his hands clenched tightly by his sides, watching as the contractors picked up the broken pieces of wood and the scattered tools. It wasn't just a ramp she had destroyed, it was a symbol of something far greater, a path to a better life for Maria, a path that would grant her the freedom to move through her own home, to live without the daily struggle of relying on others just to get from one room to the next. Maria had suffered for so long, and now, thanks to this woman, the progress they had made in making their home more accessible had been brutally undone. Carlos's chest tightened as the weight of it all settled on him. The ramp wasn't just about convenience, it was about restoring Maria's sense of independence, something that she had lost over the years as her mobility decreased. For him, it was about more than just the physical structure, it was a lifeline, a promise to Maria that he would do everything in his power to make her life easier, more dignified, and more free. And now Karen had shattered that promise. The contractors were already discussing what would need to be done to fix the damage, but Carlos couldn't focus on their words. He couldn't bring himself to think about the construction process, not yet. He just stood there, seething with anger, barely able to comprehend how Karen had justified what she had done. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear that it wasn't just about the ramp. It was about control, about her need to assert her dominance over something that was not hers to control. The fact that she had destroyed something so essential for his wife's well-being, without even a second thought, spoke volumes about her lack of empathy, her disregard for the lives of others. For a moment, Carlos wanted nothing more than to confront her again, to force her to face the reality of what she had done, but he knew that would only escalate things further. He couldn't afford to be reckless, especially now when everything was already in jeopardy. The silence around him was broken by the sound of Maria's voice calling out from the front door. "Carlos," she called gently, her voice still carrying the softness that she had always had, despite the pain she had endured. He turned around, his heart aching as he saw her standing there, her cane resting against the doorframe as she leaned slightly to one side for support. She had a way of carrying herself that made it look as though she wasn't struggling, as though everything was fine, even though he knew that every movement she made cost her something. Seeing her in the doorway, her face expectant yet filled with concern, made his anger flare again, but it also reminded him of why he had to remain calm, why he couldn't let Karen's actions destroy his resolve. "I'm here, Maria," he called out to her, his voice softer now. He forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes, and he stepped toward her, doing his best to hide the frustration and the hurt. "We're just dealing with a little setback." Maria's brow furrowed as she took in his expression. "What's happened? Why is the ramp?" Before she could finish, Carlos was already at her side, wrapping his arms around her in a comforting hug. He could feel her body tense for a moment, the way she always did when something was wrong, but then she relaxed into him, her shoulders softening under his touch. He could feel the weight of her concerns in the way she held onto him, but he couldn't bring himself to explain what had happened just yet. It was still too raw, too painful. "It's nothing we can't fix," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll take care of it. We'll make sure you get your ramp, okay?" Maria pulled back slightly to look him in the eyes, her face filled with a mix of confusion and worry. "Carlos, what's going on? Why does it look like everything's been destroyed?" she asked, her gaze searching his face for answers. She could always tell when something wasn't right, even if he tried to hide it. Carlos sighed, his breath shaky as he finally let the weight of the situation hit him. "Karen did it, Maria," he said, his voice cracking. "She came over here this morning, and she ran her car into the ramp. She destroyed everything we'd worked on. All because she didn't like it. She said it was going to make the neighborhood look like a hospital." Maria's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, it seemed like she couldn't fully comprehend the gravity of what he was saying. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out at first. Finally, she shook her head, her expression a mixture of disbelief and hurt. I don't understand. Why would she do that? Why would she ruin something that's meant to help me?" Carlos could feel his own heart breaking as he watched her try to make sense of it. It was one thing to hear about cruelty from others, but it was another entirely to have it directed at someone you loved, someone who had done nothing to deserve it. "I don't know, Maria. But I'm going to make sure we get this ramp rebuilt, and if we have to go through the HOA or take legal action, we will. I won't let her get away with this." Maria placed her hand gently on his arm, her touch warm and reassuring despite everything. "Carlos, I don't want you to have to fight anyone. I don't understand why people can't see that we're just trying to live our lives. We're not asking for anything special. We just want to make our home more accessible." Her voice trembled, and Carlos could feel the weight of her words, the frustration that had been building up inside her for years. She had been fighting for her independence for so long, and now it seemed like someone had taken that from her in an instant. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. "I know, Maria," he said softly, his voice full of emotion. "I know. But we'll fix this. I promise you, we'll make sure it's right." The two of them stood there for a long moment, just holding on to each other. The weight of the situation still felt overwhelming, but in that moment, Carlos realized that it wasn't just about the ramp anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, about protecting the people he loved, and about making sure that no one would ever feel like they didn't have a place in the world. He wouldn't let Karen, or anyone else, take that away from them. As the contractors continued their work, Carlos made the decision to report Karen's actions to the HOA. He couldn't let her destroy something so important without facing consequences. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He could already imagine Karen's defensive attitude, the way she would try to shift the blame back onto him, but he was ready for it. For Maria, for their future, he would fight. He would fight for every person who had ever been made to feel less than, for every person who had been told they didn't belong. And he would make sure that their home was a place of safety, dignity, and freedom, no matter what it took. The road ahead was uncertain, but Carlos knew one thing for sure: he would not let Karen's actions define them. The ramp would be rebuilt, and the fight for Maria's independence would continue. Nothing could stop them now. The day after the destruction of the ramp, Carlos was filled with a mixture of determination and frustration. He had already spent hours trying to understand how a simple request for a basic home modification could cause so much upheaval. The ramp was never meant to be a statement or an inconvenience. It was just a solution to a problem that had plagued Maria for years. He knew that she was counting on him to make sure that this project would succeed, but as he sat at the kitchen table, his mind kept returning to the same question: why had Karen done this? What had possessed her to not only destroy something that would improve his wife's life, but also to act with such open disdain and cruelty? As the sun rose higher in the sky, Carlos found himself standing in front of the broken pieces of the ramp, trying to collect himself. He had been staring at the wreckage all morning, unable to tear his eyes away from the damage. The contractors had already left for the day, unable to do anything more until they had received the proper approval from the HOA to rebuild. Carlos had known, even before he started the project, that this might not be an easy road. But he had never expected this kind of resistance, especially not from someone in his own neighborhood, someone he'd seen around the block, someone who, on the surface, appeared to be just another neighbor. What had made Karen so determined to make their lives harder, to crush Maria's hopes for something as simple as a wheelchair ramp? He knew he had to act fast. The longer he let this fester, the more it would hurt Maria, and he couldn't afford to let that happen. It wasn't just about the physical destruction, it was the message it sent. Karen wasn't just opposing a ramp, she was opposing the idea that someone with disabilities had the right to live without barriers. She was opposing the notion that people like Maria had the right to live freely, with dignity. And that, Carlos realized, was something he couldn't let slide. It wasn't just his wife's dignity at stake, it was his family's sense of security, the very idea that they should be able to feel safe and welcomed in their own home. He wouldn't allow Karen to take that away from them. By noon, Carlos had already made several phone calls, including one to the HOA to report the destruction and to request an emergency meeting. He was ready to go on the offensive, to make sure that Karen's actions were taken seriously. It didn't matter if Karen was part of the HOA or not, he would make sure that everyone knew exactly what she had done. He had already started drafting a letter to accompany his report, detailing the events and the damage caused. It wasn't just about asking for the ramp to be rebuilt, it was about holding Karen accountable for her actions, making sure that she couldn't just get away with it. As Carlos was preparing to leave the house to deliver the letter in person, Maria came into the living room, her face drawn with concern. Her wheelchair was just inside the door, and she slowly wheeled herself over to Carlos, looking up at him with those eyes that had always held so much strength, even when her body was failing her. "Carlos," she said softly, her voice laced with a quiet understanding of what was weighing on him, "what's going on? You've been on the phone all morning. What are we going to do about this?" Carlos took a deep breath and turned to face her, his expression softening as he looked at the woman who had been his partner through everything. He could see the concern etched on her face, the worry that had taken root ever since the ramp had been destroyed. She was trying to remain strong, trying to comfort him as much as he was trying to comfort her, but he could see how much this situation was affecting her. She didn't want him to fight, she didn't want to make things harder. But Carlos knew that they couldn't just let this go. If they did, they would be sending the message that people with disabilities didn't have the right to live without obstacles, that they didn't deserve to have their lives made easier. He wouldn't stand for that. I'm going to make sure this gets fixed, Maria, Carlos said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet determination. Karen can't just come in here and destroy something that's meant to help you. We're going to rebuild the ramp, and we're going to make sure that she's held accountable for what she's done. We can't let her get away with this. Maria's expression softened, and she gave him a small, tired smile. Carlos, I don't want you to fight with anyone. I don't want to make things worse. I know this ramp means a lot to me, but I don't want you to lose sleep over this. It's just a ramp. We'll figure it out. Carlos reached down and gently placed his hand on hers. He could feel the warmth of her skin, the softness of her touch, and it reminded him why this fight was so important. It wasn't just about a ramp, it was about making sure she had the life she deserved, a life where she didn't have to struggle just to get to the kitchen or the bathroom. It was about dignity. It was about respect. He couldn't, in good conscience, let anyone take that from her. I'm doing this for us, Maria, he said, his voice filled with love and conviction. I'm doing this for you. We'll make sure this gets done, and I'm going to make sure that no one ever tries to tear us down like this again. You deserve better than this. You deserve to live without limitations, and I'm going to make sure you can. Maria's eyes shimmered with emotion, and for a moment, she said nothing. She just looked at him, her face softening as she absorbed his words. She knew that he was doing this because he loved her, and she knew that he would fight for her, no matter what. And although she wanted to tell him to stop, to not let this consume him, she also knew that the fight was necessary. Carlos had always been the one to fight for her, and if that meant going up against people like Karen, then so be it. After a moment, Maria nodded, her expression resolute. All right, Carlos, she said softly, I trust you. Just be careful, okay? I will, he replied, squeezing her hand gently before turning to grab the letter he had prepared. I'm going to the HOA now. I'm going to make sure they understand exactly what happened, and I'm not backing down. As Carlos left the house and walked down the driveway toward his car, he felt a surge of purpose. He had no idea how long the battle would last, but he was determined to make it count. He knew that this wasn't just about one ramp, it was about creating a community where people like Maria, like him, could live without fear of being judged or excluded. Karen's actions had shown just how far some people were willing to go to impose their will on others, but Carlos was ready to make sure that people like Karen would no longer be able to tear others down. When he arrived at the HOA office, Carlos felt the weight of the situation settle on him again, but he pushed the fear aside. He wasn't just advocating for a wheelchair ramp, he was advocating for the right to live without barriers. He walked into the building, prepared to stand up for his wife, for himself, and for anyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. He was ready for this fight, and he would not let it go unanswered. Inside, he handed the letter to the receptionist, who nodded in acknowledgement. We'll review this and get back to you as soon as possible, she said, her tone polite but neutral. As Carlos left the office, he knew it wouldn't be the last time he'd have to return. This was only the beginning, but he was prepared to take it as far as it needed to go. For Maria, for their future, he would fight until the very end. Days passed after Carlos had submitted his letter to the HOA, and the anticipation of what might come next weighed heavily on his mind. He spent his time making arrangements for the reconstruction of the ramp, though he couldn't help but feel the anger from Karen's actions still simmering inside him. Each day brought its own frustration. Every time he looked at the remnants of the ramp, he was reminded of the personal battle he was fighting, not just for a simple home improvement project, but for the right to allow his wife the independence she deserved. The paperwork and phone calls to the HOA became a blur, but Carlos kept pushing forward, determined to make sure Maria's needs were met. Every interaction with Karen and the HOA felt like a battle and a war he hadn't expected to fight. It wasn't long before the HOA called for a meeting to discuss the incident, and Carlos felt his heart race as he prepared for the confrontation. Maria, who had been mostly silent about the matter, expressed concern for how things might escalate, but she knew how important it was to Carlos to ensure their voices were heard. She didn't want him to carry the weight of the fight alone, but she also understood that the most important thing was for them to regain a sense of normalcy. Despite the stress that had accumulated over the last few days, they both knew that the ramp was just the beginning of something much larger, an issue of respect, dignity, and fairness that transcended the immediate problem. When the day of the HOA meeting arrived, Carlos found himself standing outside the office building, feeling both defiant and uncertain. He had prepared himself for whatever the HOA board might throw his way. He knew that Karen would be there, and he also knew that the room was likely to be filled with people who were sympathetic to her, given her role in the community. As he entered the building, he couldn't help but wonder how many others would silently back her actions, choosing to remain quiet rather than stand up for what was right. The conference room was sterile and professional, with a long wooden table at its center. The board members were already seated, flipping through papers and reviewing the details of the case. The room was silent when Carlos entered, and as he approached the table, he could feel the weight of their eyes on him. At the far end of the room sat Karen, arms crossed and face tense, a smug look of superiority etched onto her features. Carlos could feel his frustration flare up once again, but he took a deep breath, reminded himself of why he was here, and approached the table. He wasn't here to argue with Karen, he was here to stand up for his wife, for their family, and for what was right. The HOA president, a man in his late 40s with a polished suit and a calm demeanor, was the first to speak. "Carlos, thank you for joining us today," he said in a measured tone. "We've received your letter, and we've reviewed the situation. I understand this matter is important to you and your family, and we appreciate your willingness to engage in dialogue." His words, though respectful, felt rehearsed, as if he was trying to smooth over the seriousness of the issue at hand. He continued, his gaze shifting to Karen, "We also have Karen here today, and we'll give her an opportunity to explain her actions." Carlos nodded but couldn't keep his emotions in check. "I don't need to be told what happened," he said, his voice steady but firm. "What happened was simple. Karen destroyed the wheelchair ramp that was being built for my wife. She used her car to ram into the construction, all because she didn't like how it looked. And then, when I confronted her, she didn't apologize. She said it was because the neighborhood didn't need a hospital ramp and that it would ruin the aesthetic of the area. I don't know how else to explain it. It was malicious and completely unjustified." Karen, who had remained silent up until this point, finally spoke up, her voice dripping with defensiveness. "I didn't destroy anything. I simply took action to prevent something that would have lowered property values. This neighborhood is about maintaining a certain standard, and this ramp, would have been an eyesore. We don't need a hospital set up in front of everyone's homes." Her words were laced with a condescending tone, and she didn't seem the least bit sorry for her actions. Instead, she appeared to be doubling down on her position. Carlos clenched his fists at his sides, his frustration rising, but he forced himself to remain composed. This wasn't about aesthetics. This was about my wife having access to her own home. It was about giving her some independence back, something you clearly don't seem to understand. You had no right to destroy something that was meant to help her. It's not about the neighborhood's look, it's about a human being's need to live with dignity. And you didn't even stop to think about that before you ran your car into the ramp." His words were sharper now, the hurt he felt evident in every syllable. "My wife isn't some inconvenience that can be pushed aside just because she doesn't fit into some neat little box that you've decided this neighborhood should conform to." The room was silent as Carlos spoke, and even Karen seemed taken aback by the intensity of his words. For a moment, there was no immediate response from anyone in the room, and Carlos could feel the tension building. It was clear that this wasn't just a matter of a ramp being destroyed, it was a statement about who had the right to exist in this space and who didn't. Maria had become the target of someone else's narrow-minded view of the world, and Carlos couldn't allow that to go unchallenged. Finally, the HOA president cleared his throat, looking from Carlos to Karen, clearly trying to navigate the delicate situation. "I understand your frustration, Carlos. But we have to consider both sides here. Karen, I understand you acted out of concern for the neighborhood, but we also have to recognize that the ramp was a legal project. The permits were approved, and there's no question that it was a necessary modification for Maria's well-being. While I understand the concerns about neighborhood aesthetics, those should never come before the needs of residents." The president's words were measured, but there was a hint of growing unease in his tone as he continued, "Karen, I'm afraid your actions in destroying the ramp were unacceptable. Not only did you violate the trust of your neighbors, but you also committed an act of property damage." Karen's face turned red with frustration as she heard the president's words, but she didn't speak up again. Instead, she looked down at her hands, her defensive posture fading slightly. The board members exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room. Carlos knew that this was his moment to drive home the point. "This isn't about whether the ramp looks good," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "This is about ensuring that my wife can live her life without barriers. She shouldn't have to fight for basic access to her own home. I'm asking for accountability. I'm asking for you to stand with us, not with someone who sees disabled people as a nuisance." The silence in the room felt heavy, but it was finally broken when one of the other board members, a woman in her late 50s with a stern but sympathetic face, spoke up. "I think it's clear that Karen's actions went too far," she said, her voice resolute. "This was not a reasonable response. We can't have people taking matters into their own hands. What happened here was unacceptable." After a few more moments of deliberation, the HOA president addressed Carlos directly. "We are going to take action. We will ensure the ramp is rebuilt, and we'll work with the contractors to expedite the process. Karen, we will also need to discuss the consequences for your actions, as what you did was not only destructive but also damaging to the community. We can't let this type of behavior go unchecked." Karen sat in silence, her face red with anger and embarrassment as the decision was made. Carlos felt a sense of relief wash over him, though he knew the fight wasn't truly over. This was just one small victory, one step closer to getting Maria the access she deserved. But as he left the meeting room, he knew that the fight wasn't just about a ramp, it was about making sure that people like Karen could no longer dictate the terms of their existence. It was about making sure everyone, regardless of their mobility or limitations, could live in a world that respected their dignity. For Carlos, this was just the beginning. But he was ready.